What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Othercide, an indie roguelite TRPG that touts a very unique visual style. But before we dive into that, just to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games like this all the time, both the genre and after 100%, and while that includes the achievements, it does include a lot more than that, though the achievement list for this one is pretty thorough. And to that end, my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. But with that said, Othercide is a relatively short indie title, so as such, it tends to make for a pretty short review in these cases. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and dive into this thing. The game blends roguelite elements with a TRPG, so if you're familiar with each of those genres, you might kind of get the gist of what I'm talking about, but basically, as a TRPG, the game is a constant stream of turn-based tactical battles that usually take the form of missions. As a roguelite, you are often expected to fail and then sort of start again. However, there is a way to sort of keep progressing at the same time, so you don't literally start from the beginning, but rather you gain some core elements from your playthroughs that then aid your subsequent runs. So even if you die and fail, you are typically always progressing via a variety of mechanics that we'll definitely discuss here. But the first thing I want to talk about is the story setup for this game. Now, truth be told, it's very cryptic and deals with a lot of, I would say, subtext more than outright explaining what is going on. But the general gist of it is that we play as a character known as the Mother. She is killed in a battle that sees suffering, as they call it, take over the world in a sort of Lovecraftian manner, breeding all sorts of horrors that the spirit of the Mother sends echoes of herself, known as her daughters, to fight against. The daughters act as our units, and we're fighting against suffering and its minions in order to try to undo all of this. However, as you play through the game, you'll probably notice that a lot of it seems to revolve around one particular child, with many of the game's events and story and lore that is presented to you seeming to imply that all of this might be sort of subtext for childhood trauma that this kid went through, with all of these boss enemies kind of representing the worst of humanity's crimes against itself. Now, broadly speaking, I do think there's a few different ways you could probably interpret this story. I think that's by design, and while it's certainly interesting enough, typically speaking, story in these type of games takes a little bit of a backseat to the actual turn-based battles. But as you might imagine, given everything you've seen in the video up to this point, a lot of it's pretty dark and messed up. And as you play through the game, you'll unlock little lore tidbits where you can read a bit more about what happened and events surrounding everything. That all does a really good job of setting up the atmosphere. Now, last note on the story here, I guess, because I really don't know where else to put this. While there is no outright nudity in the title, there is a lot of sort of silhouettes of nudity, which is hardly a big deal for a game like this anyway. But I did want to mention that if any of the footage may seem a little strange compared to what I'm talking about, what I'm probably trying to do is avoid menus or backdrops where that is visible, as YouTube can be a little sensitive when it comes to things like that. But from there, let's talk a little bit about the difficulty of the game. There are two difficulty modes, and they're both honestly probably pretty challenging for you, I would say, at least in terms of the core experience, but Nightmare is the sort of original difficulty, and then you can also play on Dream. Dream will be a little bit easier as your characters will heal in between missions, and you also get one free resurrection for every run, known as a recollection. So every time you attempt the story before you die as a recollection, you'll get a free resurrection token for that every single time. This makes some of the game a little bit easier, but it doesn't really alter much else. However, it can save you a little bit of a headache in terms of the sacrificial mechanics that we're about to get into. Because that brings us to progression, which, as you might imagine, for a roguelite TRPG, kind of encompasses the entire game in many ways. But as I've already mentioned, the game is structured as missions. More specifically, these take place over the course of days. Every day you have to complete at least one mission, and every daughter you have can only participate in a mission once per day. Typically speaking, there are a few events that will change this. Once that's done, you can rest, which will then bring you to the next day. For each mission you complete, there are a handful of rewards that are usually currency, being vitae, shards, and experience. Experience, of course, leveling up your units, your daughters. Vitae being an important resource for upgrading the skills of your daughters, as well as making more daughters, which is naturally pretty important when you're managing multiple fighting units in a game like this. But some important things to note. Every time you complete a mission and gain shards, that is a permanent increase to the shards you have available to you every single run. You can spend shards during a run on remembrances. Remembrances are buffs. These do a large variety of things like increasing damage, making your daughters stronger, making buffs to your skills cheaper to equip, etc. And once you've started progressing into the later acts of the game, the remembrances will also allow you to skip ahead back to where you were, so you don't have to fight the same enemies and bosses over and over again. You can skip ahead to the act you were already on. But with these being done with this remembrance system, you do have to activate these in order to do this, meaning that if you don't activate them, you'll start from the beginning. And all you have to do to see how to unlock a remembrance is click on it. It'll tell you what you need to do. All of the progression ones are typically related to killing the bosses. And in each act, the first 4 days, you can't fight the boss right away. You have to discover the boss. And then once the boss is discovered on that run and any other run, you can fight the boss whenever you want until you hit about day 7, where the game will force you into the boss fight. Now, from there, let's talk about our daughters a little bit and their progression, as it is pretty central to the game itself. For starters, there's a lot of mechanics around death and rebirth. If you're not playing on Dream, so playing on Nightmare, your daughters do not heal without being sacrificed to one another, meaning that if you get damaged in combat, that's permanent until that daughter either dies or you sacrifice another daughter of equal or higher level to heal them. However, death for your daughters is not truly the end. They get sent to your cemetery pool, which is a pool of all your recently dead daughters. However, when they die, they don't lose the experience they had gained or anything. They retain their level and experience, meaning that if you have resurrection tokens, you can bring them back. This also persists through various runs of the game. And because of this mechanic, what typically winds up happening is that you keep using the same daughters over and over again so that they continuously get stronger and stronger. Some of the remembrances you can get are resurrection tokens, to where you start resurrecting your entire main team every single time that you start a run. And this becomes basically mandatory towards the end of the game. You can get away in the early game with kind of cycling through a lot of them, as there's a remembrance that ups their starter level as well when you make new daughters. However, late game, this becomes less of a possibility once their sort of max starting level starts to not be enough. As your daughters gain experience, they pick up more and more skills. They start with just a basic 2, but as they start leveling up to 15, they get extra skills. You get a choice between 2 for each of the levels at which you gain one. And as your daughters participate in combat, they can also pick up various traits which increase their effectiveness, which varies a little bit by class, which we'll talk about in the combat section in just a moment. And because of the way this works, the daughters that you use and resurrect all the time become easily your strongest ones, and I would recommend eventually getting yourself a team of about 5, as that is the maximum you can have on any given mission. That brings us to the combat section. As I've mentioned a couple times, and I'm sure you've seen on screen, turn-based tactical battles using your daughters. Your daughters themselves can be up to 4 classes. There are only 3 to start with, but about halfway through the story you will unlock a 4th class. When you make a new daughter, you will get to pick which class they become, and every time you start a run, you will start with 3 daughters, each one being one of the base classes. Because of this, and the relatively limited size and scope of this game, is where the game gets kind of simple. So you really only have a few classes, which means in each situation there's typically a best option or 2. And with the very progression-oriented nature of a roguelite, you can kind of just grind to win. You can sort of keep restarting runs over and over again using the same daughters to then level them up and grind them up to where they get ridiculously strong. But in spite of this, the combat is pretty good. It's a little more stat-focused than you would probably initially think, especially when you get to the late game, which we'll talk about. But until you get your daughters to that higher point with all the remembrances and buffs and skills, etc., there is a sort of fun, quick, repeatable, tactics-oriented game here where you can utilize the characters to their maximum effectiveness. Your Blade Master is going to be dealing the most damage, but typically has to get into melee range. Later on, they have a few skills to help with with this. You also get a shield bearer, which tends to be your tank, and the person who can disrupt the enemy. Then we have our soul slingers. These are your ranged combatants, and they can also later provide support to the rest of your party, giving them extra turns, or faster turns, I should say. And then finally, we have the Scythe Dancer. This is a great one for taking down armor of the enemy. As there aren't a ton of stats in this particular game, it's mostly just damage and armor. Armor will, as you might imagine, reduce incoming damage, and it is possible, if an enemy has enough armor, that you do 0 damage. So somebody like the Scythe Dancer who can steal armor away from enemies is very helpful, and the Blade Master typically does so much damage that they can completely remove it. Another option available to you though is that each skill of the daughters can be upgraded with a memory, which are gained from killing enemies in combat. Memories can be slotted to an individual daughter's skills on a per-run basis that augments it in some way, dealing extra damage, more chances for a critical hit, or removing armor, for instance. And overall, it can make you much stronger if you're using it, and you spend the blood that you earn from completing missions on attaching memories to various skills. Another thing this game does is it's sort of timeline order. Now, this being a turn-based game, it sort of uses an action point system. Every turn, your daughters will get 100 action points. However, only the first 50 are your normal turn. On the timeline system, down at the bottom of the screen, at 0, it is that character's turn. When you use up your daughter's regular turn, the first 50 action points, this resets your character to 50 on the timeline, up to a maximum of 100. If you use more than 50 AP in a single turn, which you likely will, this is known as burst. This doubles the recovery time for that character, so instead of 50, you go all the way to 100. And learning how best to manage this timeline system is a big part of combat as well, because there are some enemies that only have a recovery time of like 30 to 40. So learning how to deal with and manage all of that is a big part of it. When to use the burst, which is effectively a second turn, versus when not to use it, etc. And overall, it makes for a pretty satisfying experience. Now, unfortunately, the combat of this game is not without its problems. And I would say the biggest by far is the lack of variety. Over the course of the game, you're going to be fighting a lot of the same enemies in a lot of the same arenas. There's only a handful of different types of enemies, and as you progress through the game, you just start fighting stronger variants of the same enemy. So because of this, you can see a lot of repetition pretty quickly. And that brings me to the boss fights. The boss fights are a bit more like puzzles if you are the appropriate level to be fighting them. You can get to a point where, especially the early bosses, you'll just absolutely destroy in a couple of hits, and the tactics don't matter as much. But mostly, they are a sort of puzzle that you have to work out how to attack them and manage their actions and reactions. And likely, you'll find yourself using your more powerful abilities here, which instead of costing action points, cost a percentage, typically, of your own daughter's health pool, which combined with the sacrifice and regenerate mechanics makes for a dicey exchange. And while I think the first 4 bosses are really interesting, the last boss in particular is not a bad boss by any means, but I think is a problem in terms of the progression for the rest of the game. The last boss is a massive step up in difficulty from the entire rest of the game. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, that's what you want from a last boss. The problem is that you likely will not beat the last boss without grinding substantially to do so. In fact, it was grinding in preparation to actually beat the last boss that I got most of the 100% for this game done. And I think it creates this sort of interesting situation where the combat and the repetition of enemies and arenas isn't that bad until you get to that last boss grind you're going to have to do, where you suddenly realize you're going to have to do this over and over again to get your characters to a point where you can fight the last boss, because it's such a jump up in sort of the natural progression up to that point that it becomes a real pain point in an otherwise well-paced title. And it really highlights the biggest flaw of the system, which I personally think was a mistake. But all of that brings us to the Steam Deck section of the game. TRPGs typically play very well on the Steam Deck, but when I went to play this particular title, Steam's official rating is actually not supported. Even in these cases, I'll typically check it out, download it, see if it just won't play or what the issue is. And to my surprise, Othercide played almost perfectly on the Steam Deck, as most TRPGs do. However, after playing it it for a little bit, I noticed that the game drained my battery from almost full to 10% in the span of about 15 minutes. At first, I thought this must just be a weird error, so I charged my Steam Deck, tried again, and it happened a second time. And then, just for my own sanity, I charged it a second time, then played another game just to see what happened, to make sure it wasn't hardware error, and I didn't have this issue. So for whatever reason, the Steam Deck will play Othercide, but it just demolished my battery far beyond what would be acceptable in any way. I don't really know exactly what that's about or how that could even be fixed, but I imagine that's probably why the game has a not supported rating on the Steam Deck, so I can't really recommend it there, which is a shame because it actually played really well. But that brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, for the most part, until you get to that last boss grind, it's a short and sweet TRPG. It's probably a pretty good one for beginners up to that point as well, as a lot of the mechanics are relatively simple. With the dream mode, you can even make it a little easier for yourself. And if you want to see what TRPGs are kind of all about, and you enjoy the visual style of this game, this is probably a pretty good place for you to start. And a big positive for me was the visuals themselves. I really like the art style of this game, the sort of Lovecraftian horrors that you're fighting against. All of that was very cool to me. Now, on the negative side, we have the repetition, which really rears its head as you start grinding to prepare for the last boss, which is why I imagine this game only has like a 6% completion rate according to Steam statistics. And while most people don't finish games in general, that is also a very low number for the last boss. Typically, it's like 20 to 40%. So with my own experience and those metrics, it seems pretty obvious to me people probably get to that part and just go, no thank you. And I can't really blame them because that part of the game isn't fun. It's just a lot of the same enemies, same fights, same arenas for hours while you get ready for a boss, and the game has nothing new to offer you at this point. And I think that's easily the biggest place this game drops the ball in, which is a shame because almost everything else about it is really fun. All of that brings us to our conclusion. Ultimately, Othercide is a great TRPG that really drops the ball right at the end of the game. And while it typically, full price, will run you about $30, the game itself has been out for a couple of years. It originally released back in 2020, I believe, which means, of course, that you can regularly find it on sale. I personally picked it up for like $15. So while I would say the game is definitely worth a look and a buy, realistically, with it being a few years old, you could easily just wait for a convenient sale to pick it up and check it out, as what it does well vastly outweighs what it does poorly, which makes for a mostly great experience. So that is all I've got for you guys today. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.